Welcome to our class. I was also thinking this morning, sitting behind Paul, that one of the things he says, that Paul Simmons will say to a bunch of kids, recruits, and all their families in the room, he'll say, if you're on your phone right now, you don't belong here. Or something that stern. I don't know exactly the words, but it's something like that. So he is addressing what has created the anxious generation, even in recruiting sessions. And to hear Phil tell it, parents are in tears. They're saying, oh, I want my son to come play football here so bad. But I can understand that. We even touch on sports a little bit this morning. We talk about girls, boys, and wounded souls. The impact of social media on all of the above. The frame that we set for the class, the first week of class, is from Philippians 4. And yes, it's partly because the book is entitled The Anxious Generation. Jonathan Haidt is not coming from a place of faith, so we supply the faith perspective in response to the book. But from Philippians 4, where Paul says, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I'll say it, rejoice. Let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near. Don't be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and petition, present your requests to God with thanksgiving. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Then this line, finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, whatever is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. Can we fix our minds on things that are true and noble and right and pure and so forth? When our knee-jerk reaction is anytime there's a pause in the action, we pull out our phones and just mindlessly scroll through our phones. Probably not helping us to cultivate this life that's not anxious. And that's what we want to address in these chapters. The thesis of the book, some of you are here for the first time because our class began around the Thanksgiving break. So welcome to this class. We'll meet today and then only one more week. Haidt's main premise is this. There are two trends he's observing: that there's overprotection in the real world and underprotection in the virtual world, that are the main reasons why children born after 1995, otherwise known as Generation Z, are now the anxious generation.
So last week we talked about safetyism, the dangers of safetyism, how we need safetyism, right? We need our kids to know what's safe and what's not safe, but how we've gone so far the other way that has caused some of that overprotection in the real world. We talked about how it sabotages discover mode. If you were here last week, you remember that children desperately need discover mode to stay discovering things, to grow developmentally. That safetyism in coordination with the rewiring of childhood has proved to be an experience blocker. So preventing children from learning how to care for themselves, deal with frustration, disappointment, and risk. And I love this quote a lot from Jonathan Haidt, which ironically, I was going to suggest you all follow him on social media, which I know we're sort of, yeah, I get it. It's a little weird. But I follow him on Instagram, and he kind of does a lot of elaborating as new research comes in and it's sharing. He's great. So he says, the phone is an experience blocker. You spend a lot less time in the presence of other people. You're not with your friends. You're sleeping less. You're in nature less. You read fewer books. You don't have time for anything else. You have less of almost everything, which I think is true.
You have Instagram?
Yeah. Yes.
You're grounded.
Okay. That's good, Dad. Yeah.
She's 42.
At least I don't have a backgammon addiction. So, nothing.
Totally missed it.
Yeah. Yeah. So one of the things I was going to mention here too, interestingly, so I'm a college and career counselor at BB High School, and the University of Arkansas, they make the students do separate essays every year for their application. And one of their questions, you have to write about 3 books you've read, and it can't be books for class. And my kids cannot do it. None of them have read 3 books. So this is real. This is a real thing, for sure.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's not surprising. I mean, if there are any college students here, don't take this personally. But watching the college student crowd, that's not surprising. I mean, when we require a couple of books for a class, it's like we're torturing them. It's too difficult.
So this week we're talking about how social media disproportionately affects girls, how it wounds girls, and then how video games and pornography is affecting boys. Now, just Haidt speaks in some generalizations by gender, and we're going to do the same, but we very much want to stress that we know that social media is also harming and wounding boys, and that pornography and video games are also harming and wounding girls. So the generalizations do not mean that we're not impacting across the board with these things. What Haidt says also on his social media page, which you should follow, the real world is so much safer than we think, and the virtual world is every bit is as dangerous, if not more, than we think, which I think is true.
Yeah, by the way, I just wrote the outline for next Sunday and sent it to Rachel, who does the PowerPoint. But I was thinking next Sunday we're going to pause and take some polls, like polls where you actually have to have your phone.
Also
there are
ironic.
two reasons. It's ironic, but there are two reasons for that. One is in classes at the university right now, sometimes I'll ask students to take out their phone. They're not allowed to have their phones on their table, or they have to put it in their backpack. But I'll say, take out your phone, and we're going to do this Mentimeter poll. And they type in the thing, and I can see their response anonymously to a poll in class. We're going to do that maybe 3 times next week. But part of the reason is because I think it's healthy for all of us to see some live feedback from the whole class that's anonymous. Also, next week, we're going to invite you to make a commitment about your own cell phone usage. A lot of what we're talking about here is about Gen Z, but I think we all know ourselves well enough to know that probably all of us could use a smartphone sabbatical. Maybe 1 day a week, maybe 1 day a month, maybe 1 week a year, maybe 1 month a year. And right now when I say a sabbatical from not just smartphones, but a sabbatical from screens, some of you are thinking, well, it can't be Saturday during football season, or Sunday during football season, or Thursday during football season, or Monday during football season. So it's got to be Tuesday or Wednesday. I realize when we even toss out the possibility of having a 1 day a week sabbatical from screens, that a lot of us are going to be nervous about that. Well, we'll see how nervous you are next week when I ask you to do a live poll, but there will be more interaction on that next week. This book talks about the case of Alexis Spence. She was 10 years old when her parents gave her iPad for Christmas, on which she would pay this thing called, what? I don't know how to pronounce that.
Webkins? I don't know about this either.
Does anybody know how to say that? Webkins? Webkins, I've never heard of before I read the book. It's a virtual stuffed animal game, which sounds completely boring. Can somebody tell us how this works? I don't understand what would be addictive. So, Tanya.
Compare it to having a Barbie, and then you have a Barbie house, and you have all the Barbie accessories. This is just for they look like little virtual stuffed animals, and you buy rooms in the house, and you buy different toys and things to go in their house. That's it.
But it's all online. You don't actually own a stuffed animal. You do? I'm disturbed that so many of you are familiar with Webkins.
But we're not judging you.
Yeah. Somebody had a comment over there.
I was just going to say the same thing. I had one when I was little. You would buy the actual physical stuffed animal, and then it would come with a code that you could enter, and your stuffed animal would pop up on the screen.
Oh.
And you could give it different names.
Wow.
It was really fun.
This, I'm sure it was. This apparently went too far. In 2013, Alexis's friends teased her about playing such a childish game, urged her to open an Instagram account, which of course her parents said no. Her family was one of those families back in 2012 when she was just getting started. They had only one family computer. It was in a common space in a public part of the house. Screens in the bedrooms were forbidden, so it sounds like they were handling this well, but...
doing their best. But Alexis managed to open an account anyway at age 11, claiming to the app that she was 13, because as we've established, these social media companies are not actually really enforcing age limits. 13 is too young anyway. But she downloaded Instagram and deleted and reloaded it frequently to avoid detection from her parents, until she learned from her friends how to hide the app behind the calculator icon. And from what I understand, the iPhone 15 has made it even easier to hide apps. Is that fair? Is that true?
iOS 8.
Thank you. So they've made it even easier to hide apps, which I don't know how they sleep at night for that. But her parents eventually found out and started monitoring it so she would open secondary accounts. At least my students, they have their Instagram account and then they have their, what's it called? It's called something. Their burner account. Okay, Finsta. Okay, well, that's not the name I was thinking. It's okay.
Insta?
Fake, yeah, their fake account. That's what they call them. They call them their fake accounts. So it's even a thing that every teenager I know has their Instagram account that their parents see, and then they have their fake account, right, that they can put things on. So Alexis was thrilled as her following started to climb.
It's time to retire. Fake Insta? Finsta?
Yeah, we're good,
Never
Dad.
heard of it.
Let's move forward.
5 months after she opened her first Instagram account, she drew a picture describing herself as stupid, fat, ugly. The drawing suggested you just kill yourself, nobody loves you, this sounds terrible. We're going to show you a picture of that picture in just a second. Instagram algorithms had also picked up on her interest in fitness, which led to photos of models, fitness models, other kinds of models, diet advice, and yes, pro-anorexia content. I didn't know that there were such websites. I read a different book. I think Dopamine Nation talks about pro-anorexia content too. So most of us would know that if you have a child that's struggling with an eating disorder, this is terrible. I remember a therapist said to me once, if she has a real eating disorder, you hope she doesn't have a real eating disorder. This is very, very difficult to overcome and usually requires a residential stay in a facility somewhere. But here are pro-anorexia accounts. Don't let people tell you this is a bad thing. Don't let people tell you you should eat. You control your own body. You don't have to eat if you don't want. I mean, yeah, that actually exists. She was in the 8th grade when she was hospitalized for this eating disorder, battled eating disorders and depression through her teen years. She was 21 when this book was published, and in 2022, then 2023, her parents filed a lawsuit against Facebook and Instagram. Spence versus Meta. You can Google it. And there are 1,000 plaintiffs that are part of that same lawsuit, especially when Frances Haugen came out, something we mentioned last week, I think. Frances Haugen, the whistleblower at Facebook, said Facebook and Instagram did this deliberately. They knew what would hook kids on this obsessive kind of behavior with likes and so forth. They knew it when they did it, and that's why at least the Spence family and 999 other families, and in fact, if you'll Google it, you'll see all kinds of lawsuits around the country. One that's from the state of Utah, suing Facebook and Instagram and Reddit and other kinds of platforms, suing them because of what all this is doing to kids. The picture?
Yeah, so this is the picture that was entered in evidence that Alexis drew. And we all know, 1,000 stories like this. If you work with teenagers at all, or even struggles with ourselves, especially us ladies who are on social media, we can relate to some of the struggle for sure. So we're going to move into talking about how social media disproportionately harms girls. And as we said, it harms both boys and girls. And I also want to say that all these figures, this is anecdotal, but I'm a counselor in a high school, and I can tell you that these are all so underreported. Like the amount of time kids are spending is much more than is being reported, right? These are self-reports. Kids are spending way more than 5 hours a day on social media. Their alerts are going off constantly. So girls who say that they spend 5 or more hours each day on social media are 3 times as likely to be depressed as those who report no social media time. So that's probably pretty obvious to us, and a scary graph for sure.
Why are girls especially vulnerable to the harmful effects of social media? Jonathan Haidt has 4 suggestions. We'll walk through them one at a time, but let me just tell you what the 4 are. Girls are more affected by visual, social comparison, comparing themselves, the way they look, to the way other girls look or are supposed to look in the culture, that aggression is more relational than physical among girls. So among boys, they tend to get physical with each other and horse around and kind of fight and play rough. But aggression is more relational than physical among girls. For girls more easily share emotions, and sometimes those are very negative emotions. And girls are more subject to predation and to harassment. Let's talk about them.
Okay, so on that first one, we don't have to spend just a ton of time because we could make a class out of any one of these, right? But girls are more susceptible and always have been to social comparison, perfectionism. And this is just, I know most of us have seen these kinds of images on social media, or I've seen videos where they'll show like a blank slate and it shows everything that goes into making that image look perfect for social media. But this is just one example that Haidt shares in his book of how these kind of doctored images are giving girls just unbelievably impossible things to compare themselves to. And we talked about in a previous class about the trajectory of depression and anxiety for girls when, say, Instagram filters were created or Snapchat filters, right? Even the filters make girls look perfect on social media. And we can know the filters are there, we can know the images are doctored, and it still spikes the anxiety, depression, and comparison.
This is a line from a song?
It is a line from a song.
Have you ever heard of this person?
I have, yeah.
Olivia, how do you say her name?
Olivia Rodrigo. I don't listen to her.
How many of you have heard of Olivia Rodrigo?
Mm-hmm.
All the Gen Zs in the room. Okay.
So, teen bodies also are changing, obviously, very fast in puberty. And so we're getting girls at a time when they're never more insecure about the way their body is changing. And so you can see here the graph about who's satisfied with themselves. In past, this has always been a struggle, right? But social media has caused us to go on a deep dive. And note, it's the same for boys. I think boys have always obviously struggled a little bit less with this, but we see a similar trajectory for boys here too.
Okay, just looking at the graph, so that means girls are less satisfied with themselves, over this
already, yeah.
period of time.
Yeah.
Less satisfied with themselves than the boys are, as far as their appearance is concerned.
Yes, appearance, everything, I think, but appearance especially. And so I think this next one, again, the appearance comparison we could talk about forever, right? But this idea that relational and physical aggression is different for girls and boys, I think most of us can see how that would be true. I was telling Dad that a few years ago, I rewatched Mean Girls. Have y'all seen that movie? Tina Fey. It was back in, I think it came out in like 2003, or it was early, right? Before this smartphone happened. And I was watching it with my stepson, and I was crying through the whole thing. And he's looking at me like, why are you crying in Mean Girls? But it was because, if you have seen Mean Girls, raise your hand if you've seen Mean Girls. So most of us have seen it. And one of the featured, this is Regina George on the left, she's the meanest girl of all, right? Until you realize that everyone's complicated and it's really sweet. So the burn book is kind of a feature in the film where these popular girls have written these mean messages about all these different people, much like the kinds of messages in Alexis's story, right? And the burn book gets passed around and it blows up and becomes this big thing. And I was crying because I was thinking, oh my goodness, we've always been like this, right? But this thing that spread, that's a physical thing, how much worse is it now? Like this kind of thing in high schools, it spreads much faster, much more widely, and it's following kids home. This isn't something they're facing at school. It's at home now, right? And so I was thinking about how much easier social media has made this instinct that we already have as girls. So again, for girls, aggression is relational, and that is a lot more painful, right? We are mean to each other when we want to be. And again, as he said, I think boys can get in a fight and be really angry with each other, and then the next day they're like, what's up, bro? Everything's fine. And that's just not how we operate. We can be really mean and biting with our words. We know how to hurt each other, and we do. And it's also a lot more difficult for parents and schools to address it when it's happening on social media, right? We can do something, like I think even in Mean Girls, they're able to get, kind of ahead of it because they find the burn book and they can do something about it. But it's so much more difficult to grasp on and do anything about. And I know in schools we have huge problems during the school day that come from social media bullying. But it's what do we do? This happened last night. right? This happened at 2 a.m. on Instagram. So how do we as a school deal with this huge fallout that's happening the next day among 10 girls because of it? It's impossible.
Is there such, I mean, what is the burn book? What's the current version of burn book?
All kinds of, you've seen social media pages. Have you seen these where there'll be a whole page dedicated to bullying a single girl who Haidt talks about one where it's a girl who didn't make the cheerleading team, and there's a whole page dedicated to, making fun of her for that. I mean, it's anything from there to the kinds of pages that will be like making fun of a girl's physical appearance, maybe calling her fat or whatever it is, right? So all kinds of things like that.
This is kind of not on that subject, but is yik yak still a thing? Is yik yak still out there?
I've never heard of that.
Yik yak is evil. If I speak in chapel, which I don't do that often, but if I speak in chapel at Harding, I'm aware that there are yik yackers out there with their phones, and they're yik yakking anonymously. It's people within proximity of each other, isn't it? But they can just completely rip on whatever's going on and make fun of it. And I think, is there a way to ban yik yak from? I don't think there is, but once again, we've got to equip people with internal controls. We can't depend on the culture to help us out on things like that. But anyway, there's a yik yak where everybody can insult everybody or anybody and do it anonymously. The fact that girls more easily share emotions is one of these factors that makes this harder on girls. Emotional contagion, he calls it, that these positive and negative emotions spread so fast among young women. There's a kind of prestige bias he talks about in the book where if you're a teenager, boy or girl, you're looking for someone to admire. But the person that we want you to admire is not necessarily the person your peer group will admire. We want you the parents, we want you to admire someone that we think is admirable. And you want to admire someone who's popular or cool. You want to sit at the cool kids table or whatever. Someone who looks a certain way or carries themselves in a certain way that's cool. Prestige bias happens when teens find out what's most prestigious among their peers and they latch on to that person, which leads to bullying. If you don't fit into that group, you're not part of that prestigious inner circle. This thing he calls audience capture means users are trained by their audience, that is indicated by the number of likes, to give the audience more of what they want and more extreme versions. Imagine a young woman drawn into that circle who becomes attached to the like and then thinks, okay, I'm going to take a picture of this and then post that or send that to that boy. And then he's asking me for this in return, and I'll take a picture of that and send that to him. And they're just drawn in. And along the way, their self-esteem is getting lower and lower and lower, but they think they're actually helping themselves by sending such pictures of themselves when, in fact, they're not. They're just lured by this audience capture phenomenon. These trends are causing an escalation in identification with certain disorders such as autism, gender dysphoria. If we've wondered why there's been such a spike in reports of gender dysphoria since 2012, how much of this is related to social media? Where now this goes back to Abigail Favale, a book we've also read that we both like, called The Genesis of Gender. Abigail Favale, teacher, used to teach feminism. I guess she does teach a kind of feminism at Notre Dame. But Abigail Favale's book talks about this spike in the self-reported cases of gender dysphoria because there are children who just feel left out. They feel different than everybody else, and they get on a website and they find out about someone who thinks they're a boy in a girl's body, and they think, oh, that's why I feel so different. Maybe that's my problem. Maybe I'm a girl in a boy's body or a boy in a girl's body. Whereas actual physiological gender dysphoria, which is a result of ambiguous genitalia, very, very rare, that leads to a real kind of gender dysphoria, then these incidents that are reported are tremendously on the rise. Got to be because of social media, planting this seed in people's minds. Predation and harassment as well. Many teen girls, this is a hard thing even to read, but many teen girls are sending nude or sexualized photos of themselves to boys or classmates under pressure. Everybody else is doing it. Why won't you send a picture? Well, I'm not going to, because in my youth group, my core group leader said, don't bow to that kind of pressure. But secretly, they're thinking, oh, I want to be with that crowd. I don't want them to think I'm a prude. So I can send a picture. I'm not actually not losing my virginity, am I, by sending them a picture of myself? So they send a picture, and here it goes. Boys may send pictures, but they get a laugh from their buddies, instead of the same sort of shame response that the girl feels inside. Girls are, of course, more subject to predation from grown men online. Maybe they pretend to be 16 years old, but online, everybody's the same age. So it could be some 60-year-old perverted man, a man with a real problem, who is preying on young girls and soliciting images from them, and who knows what sort of circle they're drawing themselves into. Rachel, you see this a lot.
Yeah, we see
high school.
this we call, it's sexting. We see this a ton at the high school level in the counseling center. We see this a lot of a girl who sends a picture of herself to her boyfriend under pressure, and then they break up, and boyfriend uses this as a weapon against her. We see this all the time. We've had multiple girls since I've been there who had to literally change schools because the shame and the pain of that situation was so great. And so this is a major problem. And I do want to say the law is catching up to this. So if you've got teenagers, it's good to remind the girls that, unfortunately or fortunately maybe, if this happens, you are also can be liable for distributing child pornography, is what they've said now. So if you're caught with this, then you will be charged, young lady who passed this to the boy, and the boy will be charged as well for passing it. So they're taking this very seriously. Yeah. So I think we all can understand this just from our own experience, right? But the great irony of social media is that we've never been more connected. We're connected all the time. Our little green dot is showing that we're connected all the time, right? And yet we've never been lonelier. So teenagers are lonelier than they've ever been, even if they have more friends, right? And that's the great irony, I think, that we see all throughout. And again, the trajectory is the same for boys.
Speaking of boys, what is happening to boys? The impact of video games and pornography on our young men. Haidt says is contributing to social disengagement and isolation among boys and men, which is evident. This is going to seem anecdotal. I don't have statistics on things like this, but the number of young men, even in our context, who are not dating, they're not asking girls out. They think I would have no chance. If someone got to know me, she would soon discover the deep, dark secrets I'm hiding, and she would reject me, so why even bother? The number of boys who respond to a survey who say they have no chance of a successful life. You can see that's high for girls too, but look how it's spiked for boys in recent years. I have no chance for a meaningful life. That percentage of young boys. How sad to be a young person in your mid-teens who would answer a survey and say, I have no chance for a meaningful life. My life is ruined already. Just find that so tragic.
So Haidt talks about the push-pull effect for boys, how in the 70s, boys and young men have started to feel pushed away from the real world, deprived of agency, and in recent decades have felt pulled into the virtual world. So the virtual world has offered what the real world cannot for boys. And then again, this has caused boys to become increasingly disconnected from the real physical world and taking their talents online. And I think we can all see evidence of that. I do want to say too that there's a lot being written about this. This is any one of these things we could spend a lot of time, multiple classes on what's happening with boys, and we're gonna recommend some books here in just a second.
Yeah, that push-pull effect, pushing them out of the real world, pulling them into the virtual world. Societal changes for boys and men. Before we go down this list, disclaimer. There's some good things about greater levels of equality for women, and of course
many good things.
We know that.
Yes.
And we're glad that women are included, but you think about it, the workforce, which requires less physical strength than it once did. There was a time, up until World War II, when the men went to work in the shipyard or in the paper mill or in the steel plant, And then World War II comes along, the men are off fighting war, and then there's Rosie the Riveter. They're making the munitions, assembling the airplanes, and the whole thing changes. It changes back for a while in the baby boomer generation. Men come home from war, and the women stay at home more. But something started where women are joining the workforce, and now in the workforce, which doesn't require more physical strength necessarily, it requires a different set of skills, and sometimes women have those skills in greater abundance than men do. Of course, you could find men with those same set of skills as women, and women with those skills that were typically considered man skills. So we don't want to go down the generalizations route, but it is evident in a statistic like this. Why are so many more women going to college than men? Why are there universities in places like Michigan offering scholarships to young freshman men? Here's a young men's scholarship because we're trying to get men to go to college. Why aren't they going to college? Why are women going to college in greater numbers than men? Is it just because they can? Is it because they're smarter? Is it because women mature faster? So at the age of 18, they have a better idea of what they want to do with their lives. So they're whereas the men probably are more in need of a gap year to figure themselves out or something. Or is there something more sinister going on? In 1972, 42% of college degrees were earned by women. In 2019, it was 59% that were earned by women. And we can tell you at Harding University, there are more women enrolled than men. Did anybody tell me what the ratio is? Probably have student life people in the room. What's the ratio, Dana?
Same as you see there.
The same ratio? Are you talking about graduation, or are you talking about just enrollment, men and women?
Enrollment would be about 60-40.
Enrollment about 60-40. Wow. That's different. Something's going on here.
So we said that there is lots of books being written right now on this topic. And I think I was actually asking my husband last night, we were talking about this effect. And again, it's wonderful that we're giving women more opportunities. But why is that necessarily at costing men, right? And we're talking about what's going on there. I actually read a book a long time ago called Redeeming Sex. Has anyone ever heard of this book? A long time ago. It was a really good book. And she talks about the playground, the pink and blue playground. Just really quick, I thought it was fascinating. And she talks about how the pink playground, the girls' playground, is vast and wide open, actually, right? And what she means by that is a girl can wear a ponytail and, gym clothes, and people are just going to think she's a tomboy, right? Where if a boy wants to knit with his mom, then he's gay, right? And she talks about how for boys, the blue playground is very narrow. And for girls, the pink playground is very wide. There's a wide variety of things we can do and still be women. We can work and we can be stay-at-home moms. We can do all of these things and still be women, right? When it's not necessarily the same if you're a boy. And I think that's a really interesting point. The best book I've read on this subject is this book of Boys and Men. By far the best book I've read. I strongly recommend it. It's a very compassionate look at what's happening with men and why what's happening with women should not be impacting men as it is. And one of my favorite quotes from this book, Haidt actually quotes, "A world of floundering men is unlikely to be a world of flourishing women," which I think is absolutely true. Dr. Hatfield sent me an article that he found about dating, the kind of dating thing that we're seeing, right? And I think that's just one of a lot of different pieces of evidence we're seeing, that what's happening with men is not helping women either.
And we see this among our young women at Harding, young women who are maturing and growing in faith and in just other ways, and then nobody's interested. There are fewer men, and those men who are there, some of them are just not interested in forming a close relationship with somebody else. There's some scary things, some indicators about this failure to launch. Did you know that young men in their 20s are more likely to live with their parents than young women are? 27% in 2018 of young men in their late 20s were living with their parents. 17% of women. If you're a young man in your late 20s and you're living with your parents, we're not trying to call you out on anything here. There are other reasons, maybe economic reasons, maybe other reasons. Maybe you're helping your parents. But why is it? I mean, I can tell you, as soon as I turned 17 and left home, came to college, I never wanted to live with my parents again. It's nothing against my parents. I was so glad to have my independence. This must be kind of like the driver's license. I got my driver's license at 16. I got my learner's license when I was 15 on my birthday, got my real permit at 16 on my birthday because I wanted to be able to drive independently of my parents. This is really scary. We talked about this and found this really scary. In the United Kingdom, they have a whole category for people who are, these are young men who are not in education, employment, or training. Not in education, employment, or training. They come up with this acronym to describe them. They're called NEETs. Young men who mostly live at home, and they're not employed, they're not going to school, they're not training for any kind of job. They're NEETs. The worst, in the UK and the US, they're mostly men. But the worst case we found was in Japan. There are more boys than girls doing this, but they have a word for them. The word in Japan, in Japanese is hikikomori. I'm sorry if you speak Japanese, I don't. Hikikomori means pulling inward. These are men, young men, who are likely to live like shut-ins by their own decision in their own home, in their own room. They use the restroom in a bucket and set it outside their door. They have their parents bring them food because they are online playing video games, watching pornography, watching whatever. They never come out of their rooms. And this is now a glorified kind of way to live. Can you imagine a world in which anybody would think being a hermit by your own choice like this would be something to praise?
It's really scary and easy to think this is fear-mongering, something like this, and it's extreme, but we do see like lesser versions of this creeping in, right? I mean, if you have a teenage boy, some of you already know that like if you were to let him do this, he would do it, right? Stay in his room and play video games all day and you bring him food if he was allowed. So some scary indicators, again, he talks about safetyism. We talked about this plenty last week, and I know we're kind of running low on time, so I want to get through this quickly. But I think we all can see how this attitude of safetyism is affecting boys more than girls to some degree, right? We talked about the Haidt shares statistics about there are many fewer injuries being reported in emergency rooms, like breaking your arm, right? The kinds of injuries you get from climbing a tree and doing all the things you're supposed to do when you're a little boy. So boys are also less likely to play sports than they used to be. My attitude has changed about sports. I used to be one of those people in high school that was like, we should not be taking so much time away from for sports from the classroom. And now I'm like, oh my goodness, we desperately need sports to create some of this anti-fragility that is so important for kids.
The great rewiring, as he describes it, means that boys have gone from playing outside in their childhood to when they would be outside playing sports to playing video games, watching pornography alone in their bedrooms, which of course is not a trend we want to see. Haidt addresses the studies that show just how bad pornography is, and we're hoping this audience doesn't need those reminders. Beth and I talk about this in a Christian families class, and we show some of the data. It's really frightening. We don't want to linger on that here or even in that class because we want to paint a positive picture of sexual intimacy when so many of our young men and young women have already given up on the idea that we will ever have a healthy sexual relationship because that ship has already sailed, they think. But pornography is the sexual manifestation of the real world, virtual world problem at the center of Haidt's work. In other words, if you've withdrawn from the real world, you don't know how to form an actual relationship with a human being, but you do know in the virtual world, this is how you communicate in the virtual world. In fact, you feel more confident by texting somebody or sexting someone than you do actually speaking to them in healthy ways. This is not a good sign, and it's getting worse. I just read something in the Atlantic this week about AI chat. I don't even know the right term for them, but they're chat box, intimate playmates. I mean, these are friends you have that's an AI-generated friend. It's not a real friend. Do you know more about that?
I mean, I've read the same article, yeah. It's a commonly increasing thing.
And it's just going to get worse with AI that somebody says, yeah,
virtual
I have a girlfriend.
reality, that kind of thing.
But their girlfriend is actually a virtual girlfriend that they don't actually have. It's a virtual AI-generated girlfriend. Just, sounds really scary.
So again, we could talk about pornography for a long time, but moving on to his other great harm he talks about for boys is video games. And again, we see this with girls too, but for whatever reason, boys are more susceptible. The gaming is playing a really large role in the lives of boys. It's doing what I think social media does for girls. It's a filler. It's something that self-medicates, right? Loneliness. He talks about a major issue of this is the opportunity cost, which is what I would agree as a counselor in high school, meaning games are eating up so much time that boys are not spending the time they should be in healthier pursuit of things like social interaction, exercise, sleep is a big one. So yeah, it's very scary to see. Further on video games, in 2023, a Canadian judge allowed parents to sue Epic Games, which created Fortnite, for addicting their sons, leading them to skip eating, showering, sleeping, etc. I would argue that the parents should have removed those games, but that's just me. Video gaming risks are not embodied real-world risks, so they're not helping kids become anti-fragile. That's super important, right? These are risky, even the risky kind of violent video games, they're not real risk. And so what it does is it gives this like almost illusion of anti-fragility that's almost worse than the real thing. Gaming is contributing to the broader problem of friendship recession in America. So in the 90s, 3% of men said they had no close friends. In 2021, that number more than tripled, right, of men who say they don't have close friends. And one thing, I know, have y'all heard of Discord? We've had to block Discord in our house. Discord, anyone? Heard of Discord? So Discord is kind of the social media platform for boys on video games. So if I'm playing video games with my friends, I can speak to them on Discord, and those threads tend to be, they can be pretty awful in terms of the kinds of content that's being spread, but also create the illusion of intimacy where it doesn't exist. I have multiple boys who are online all night with people who live in other countries, literally gaming all night with these people, and I'll say, who's your best friend? And they'll say some person who lives in Poland, and I'm like, what? But I'm telling you, that's a very, very common thing to hear these days.
This chart shows how many boys and girls say that life often feels meaningless to them. There's a common theme here, of course, that whether they're boys or girls, we're talking about social media, pornography, gaming, and so forth. What we really need is in-person, embodied, synchronous, real interaction, not the virtual kind that's anything but virtuous. In fact, it's this ugly parody of community. Where did you get that line in the message?
So in the message, it talks about in Galatians about when we do things in our way versus God's way, and it lists things that come about when we live in our way. And one of them is ugly parodies of community. And I think about that phrase all the time. How many of us are living with some ugly parody of community? Discord is an ugly parody of community, right? Social media is an ugly parody of community. I think that's really important. And I think one of the things that jumps out to me, especially with this segment, is that this is all about self, right? Like pornography, video games, social media, self is the center. In a video game, I'm the center of this universe, right? I am like everyone else is about me. It's the same with social media and the same with pornography. Boys are learning about sex on a platform that is completely 100% about what pleases them, right?
Not good training. His chapter 8 is called Spiritual Elevation and Degradation. This is where he confesses that he himself is an atheist. So I find this chapter especially intriguing. He's talking about how the phone-based life affects people spiritually by blocking or counteracting 6 basic spiritual practices. And you think, how's this guy going to write about spiritual practices? But he does a pretty good job of talking about elements of a spiritual life. I mean, he borrows from Buddhism and Hinduism and not just Christianity and Judaism, but he talks about things like this, for example.
So shared sacredness, a gathering space where collective interest supersedes self-interest. He talks about how every culture has this in some way, shape, or form. I think about what COVID did to churches. It kind of gave people an excuse, right, to stop showing up. And now we have virtual church, and a lot of people are opting into that. I'm not saying there's never a good reason to do that, but have we not gotten some permission to leave our sacred spaces, our shared sacred spaces, which supersede, again, self-interest? It's a place where you come and you're with others. It's not just about you.
Spirituality that's embodied. You don't just watch something, you don't just listen to a podcast, which may be encouraging to you, but you're participating with other Christ followers in rituals that move, We stand, we sit, we walk, we take 3 minutes to introduce each other, to pray over each other, to gather around babies and their parents. I mean, rituals in motion. This is a spiritual exercise. And eating together. How many families no longer have the spiritual practice of eating together? How many families instead, especially when their kids are teenagers, everybody comes home and there's food on the table, or maybe it's Chick-fil-A or whatever, and everybody goes back to their own space and either they watch ESPN or their kids are on their screens alone. They're not even eating together. But spirituality is an embodied pursuit.
So I joked about how this is not a good slide for me because I'm the worst at this. I'm not still silent or focused most of the time. But he talks about that as an important spiritual practice. And I actually was going to recommend a book called Every Moment Holy. Have you guys ever heard of this book? It's a beautiful book. And every entry brings tears to my eyes. But the idea is, how do we turn just normal, everyday things into something sacred? So here is a liturgy for washing clothes.
Yeah.
Here's a liturgy for your morning coffee, right? All these really beautiful things that for me have helped a lot with this idea
For
of,
mowing the lawn.
Yes.
Liturgy for mowing the lawn, which Phil Hoggard wrote, because it's a spiritual experience for Phil. Transcending the self. The virtual world is all about pleasing the self. Self is at the center, as Rachel said. A good quote from C.S. Lewis, but we're going to rush right past it to get to the others.
so being slow to anger, quick to forgive, this is something that he suggests. Again, it's so interesting reading this section of the book. If you get a chance, you should, because this is an atheist person. Especially when he talks about embodiment, I'm like, you're literally describing communion. He said, there's nothing more important than the act of eating together and sharing together. I think, so this one is probably pretty obvious about what social media has done. We've talked in the past classes about his idea that social media has a low bar for entry and exit, right? I can just block you if I don't like what you say. I think about how easy it is to be angry. In fact, if I ever unfollow someone on social media, it's usually because it'll make it way easier for me to love them in person, right? That's not going to help me to see what they wrote, you know? And so when I'm actually with you in person, there's a high bar for entry and exit, right? And I think about what Brene Brown says about, y'all know the quote I'm going to say? People are hard to hate. Anybody? Up close. People are hard to hate up close, right? So move in is what she would say.
And then the last one, find awe in nature. He's quoting from this guy, I don't know how to pronounce his name, Dr. Keltner, who's written this book on awe, the new science of everyday wonder and how it can transform your life. What's missing from a secular culture, there are many things, but one of them is the sense of awe and wonder. But if that goes away, we could talk about Enlightenment influences that, in technical terms, disenchanted the world. And now we're experiencing a kind of re-enchantment. There's an emphasis in spiritual practices these days on experiencing the re-enchantment, where actually it's never really been not enchanting. We just started studying and thinking we'd figured it all out so much that we no longer found it awesome. But in fact, it is awesome. Keltner has these 8 kinds of wonders of life. He calls them the 8 wonders of life. And we wanted to name them one by one and then hear what you had to say in the remaining 4 minutes. Beauty, moral beauty, just to appreciate a really good deed. Somebody did a selfless thing and got no recognition for it. Isn't that a beautiful thing? Collective effervescence, where we come together and there's an especially poignant moment. We all experience it together. It's like, it could be something as maybe seemingly mundane as a bison victory. The good guys won.
Too soon, Dad.
Yeah, too soon. But, more correctly, it's, and Paul Simmons would tell you, win or lose, it's a spiritual experience for that team to love each other and play together. Collective effervescence we experience here. You experience at a retreat. You experienced it on Trek when you did that time by yourself, and then you came back together as a group. Collective effervescence where we just go, wow, this is so cool. You remember it at Camp Dakota, or Camp Wildwood. You remember those moments. You experience it in nature where you see this awesome vista that makes you praise the God who made it all. You hear a beautiful piece of music that conveys sentiments and emotions that you couldn't otherwise express. In visual design, that thing just looks beautiful. Tipping our hats to all the artists in the room or architecture and design people in the room who know what a beautiful building looks like and appreciate it for its beauty, or a piece of art. Spiritual and religious awe, which overlaps with some of these things. Life and death. To me, that was something of what we experienced this morning, thinking about Ray Zerang, who died at age 92 after 70 years of marriage, and then blessing babies. Brand new babies this morning. At both ends of the spectrum, there is something awesome about both life and death. If you've ever been at the bedside of your mom or your dad when they passed, you know you were glad to be there. You will never forget that moment. It's a sacred space and a sacred moment. Epiphanies, where for me, I'm taking a shower. My best sermon ideas come in the shower for some reason, or I'm mowing the lawn. I have great ideas when I'm mowing the lawn for class or something. You have, where did that insight come from? We should attribute it to the Spirit of God, but I'm wondering what you would say in the remaining time we have about some experience you've had of any of these wonders of life. Just give an example.
I need to jump back for a second. Also, I mean, this is fantastic, but we need, kind of like the comment we ended on last time, we need to make sure that as we're pushing back, we're also looking for balance. Because this is not, barring an act of God or some kind of apocalypse, this is only going to get more involved in our lives, so we need to figure out how to make this apart. So my ears popped when you mentioned Discord specifically, and I started to think, okay, what about all the parents in here who might check their kids' phones and see Discord and think, oh no, they're staying up all night talking to people online, whereas my son, ensembles, teams, everything he's been part of, there's been a Discord that's been part of that experience that's not taking away from the personal synchronous part of it, but it's like an augmentation to it, a way they stay connected to it. So it's not that we say, okay, Discord is evil. Yeah. We say, okay, Discord has the potential to do this. Let's make sure our kids are using it in a healthy way.
Good. Like I said, we're going to try to model that next week too. Some other comment about these 8 things. 8 wonders of life. I mean, here we are, a Christian group. We breathe this stuff all the time. Hopefully, we know our God is an awesome God, and we experience the awesomeness of God in the routines of life that are never just completely routine to us.
My son-in-law listened to the prompting of the Spirit when he and his wife were planning to go to Asia for a very long time, and he said, we're not feeling called. And so I'm done with seminary, I'm moving to Cersei.
Okay.
And that's rather, it's good, but it's kind of bland until we find out that my grandson has cancer November 6th, and moving here allows them to be with family. They've already got a house, they've already got everything, and I have to say, that's spiritual and religious awe, as I say, heaven orchestrated the timing of that event for our family.
That's right. Praise God. Okay.
Talking about music up there. Can y'all hear me? A good song on people locking themselves up in their rooms that I thought of one time when I never had listened to John Mayer, but I got an album, Room for Squares, and started listening to that album and really got into it. And then I started listening to the words in that album. Well, there's a song on there, on that album, called The Great Indoors. And when I first heard that, I thought, the great indoors? No, it's the great outdoors. Anyway, I finally started listening to the words, and I thought, oh, that's John Scott. I say that funny, but anyway, because he's real into gaming when he was growing up, and he always just locked himself up in the room. But anyway, that is a really good song about that subject that was written who knows how long ago. And I even told John Scott about it. So go listen to The Great Indoors. It's pretty,
The Great Indoors, John Mayer. John Mayer, who has a story of his own.
On that subject.
I think. What's the other song about? In the Water or the Blood? What's that song called?
In the Blood.
Is it always in the water? Or is it only in the water, or is it always in the blood?
He talks about his experience with family addiction. But
yeah.
Doing one thing at a time. Like, this is something I feel the loss of in my own life because of my lack of discipline around these things, but like cooking and just cooking. walking, but just walking. Watching a movie and just doing that and not also having, it's just become an automatic thing for me that if I'm cooking, if I'm doing something, I'm going to be listening to something else. And how often I realize I'm not listening. I just want the noise. But when I'm actually able to do that, that is such a peaceful, good thing that I often just don't have the discipline for.
What a good word. Can you just cook and not be listening to something? Can you just walk and not be listening to something? I'm not saying that's evil, but could we discipline ourselves to be present in the walking? Well, one last word from Jonathan Haidt.
Yeah, so I think one of the things I was thinking about the things that were jumping off the page to me about this lesson was the idea of we need collective, we need to be together instead of just being by ourselves in the center of our universe, right? But the other thing is I was going to say, I'm glad that Marcus said that, because I know that we can come across as being pretty negative about, and sweeping about all of these things, but he's right, that this isn't going anywhere. And so the idea is not just to cut it off, but to figure out how to use it well, which is absolutely right. And we can all name some great things that have come from, say, social media, some ways that we can get messages across in a really good way, right? So learning how to balance that, I think, is really important. And I was telling Dad about, anyone seen Planet Earth? The miniseries Planet Earth. It's beautiful, but they have an accompanying one called The Human Planet. Has anyone heard of The Human Planet? They follow the same ecosystems as they do in the Planet Earth, but it's the humans that live in that ecosystem, which I think is really cool. And there's one that really sticks out to me. It was of an indigenous culture in Brazil, and it followed them, maybe it's Brazil, but it follows them as they try to get honey, and how incredibly rare honey is in nature, and how they risk their lives to get honey once in a while, and then they make that honey last. It's a very sweet dessert and treat for their family. But I was watching that thinking, that's exactly what this is, right? That sugar in nature is given to us in the quantities we should have it, right? It's provided. We've got protein everywhere, right? Because that's what we need the most of. But sugar in nature is rare. But what we've done, I think about the hypodermic needle that Dr. Lemke from Dopamine Nation talks about, how the smartphone is the hypodermic needle, right? So I think it's not that the smartphones and technology are bad enough themselves. They haven't created these problems, right? They've just given us the ability to have these things in copious quantities, right? Way more than we were ever meant to have in nature. People have always had problems when it comes to things like pornography. That's always been a problem. Anyone from, older millennials to boomers will talk about the magazines that their friends' dads had under their bed, right? That's always been a thing. It's people have always shopped too much. Women have always compared themselves too much to other women, right? These have always been a problem. But this rewiring of childhood has made it possible to have the things we were meant to have in small quantities in copious amounts. And I think that's a really important frame. So Jonathan Haidt says, again, ironically, Jonathan Haidt, the atheist, says there's a hole and emptiness in us all that we strive to fill. If it doesn't get filled with something noble and elevated, modern society will quickly pump it full of garbage. I think that's really good. In that same passage from the Message, if you get a chance, read Galatians 5 in the Message. He talks about that long list of things, including ugly parodies of community. One of the things he mentions is a stinking accumulation of mental and emotional garbage is one of the things he says comes when we live in our own way. I think we are seeing a lot of teenagers growing up with a stinking accumulation of mental and emotional garbage.
And in response to that, I think of Ecclesiastes 3:11. God has set eternity in the hearts of mankind, yet they cannot fathom what God has done from beginning to end. That emptiness they feel, we know this is there because they're made in the image of Creator God, and it won't be filled until they find Him. Next week, we're calling you to collective action. And in the spirit of Marcus Neely, who so wisely reminds us we need balance, it will not be probably challenging you to something totally, you're not cutting it out, but maybe what is a balance going to look like for you? Like maybe it's taking social media off of your phone, right? Little things. So be thinking about the call to collective action.